Welcome to episode 77 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. If you are an outsider to education, I would guess that you probably wouldn't give two thoughts to teaching reading. You would simply think, well, I know how to read. I'll just impart what I know to students. Then you might think of, how am I going to do this? Then maybe you'll think, well, I'll just show them how to read. I mean, after all, this is how I learned how to do many things in life, such as how to hook up audio and video equipment, how to change the oil in my car, and how to fry that delicious chicken. I can only imagine how befuddled you might be after a year of showing young students how to read when you realize they can't read. That's because there is a science to teaching and learning reading. This is also something that is greatly debated in the education arena. Some will swear this is the only way. Others will say that way is the best way. Some will say a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Now, I'm not looking to settle the great debate on the best way to teach reading today. Instead, I have invited a respected guest to join me to talk more about the structured literacy approach. My guest today is literacy specialist Kellyn Sirach. Kellyn has just started her 9th year of teaching, and you will find she has already had a variety of experiences in teaching reading. From these experiences, she has committed herself to learning and understanding the research behind best approaches. Kellyn has been so moved by her early experiences that she actually returned to the university to do her grad work specializing in reading. She has also done some pretty interesting work in the summer with an organization she helped co-found. She has also been named to the International Literacy Association's 30 Under 30, and you will find she is passionate about reading. Kellyn, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're excited for this conversation, but before we get going on that, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Absolutely. So from a young age, I have always loved reading. My mom would take me to the library. I would, be in book clubs. I loved reading, absolutely loved reading. And then I became really fascinated with language. And so initially, my initial major was speech language pathology. And then I saw that you had to take statistics. And I was like, nope, I'm out. Yeah. So I then talked to my grandma, who I'm super close with, and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And she told me about how whenever she grew up, she wanted to be a teacher so bad. And she actually got a full ride scholarship to SIU Carbondale and in Illinois. And but her parents couldn't pay for room and board. So she was unable to go. Yes. And so talking about that and talking about how she really wanted to teach children, that got me interested in education. And so then I looked at the course list for education and I didn't see statistics on there. And I was like, all right, I'm in. So that was kind of my pathway into education. And then once I was in, fell in love with teaching, fell in love with specifically teaching literacy, so reading and writing, and have been in education ever since. And I don't have any plans on leaving.
There are a lot of people that are excited to hear that. Now you started in a self-contained classroom. Explain a little bit about where you got started.
Yes. So initially, I was a pre-kindergarten and kindergarten teacher. I taught there for 1 year, and it was at a private Christian school. And then I moved over to gen ed, 5th through 8th grade, reading and writing. And it was there whenever I really saw I had students in these middle school or upper grades that couldn't adequately read. They couldn't fluently read. And so that really got me interested in learning more about how to help support them in reading and literacy, because all I wanted for my students was them to love reading, and so they could learn whatever they wanted to
Yeah.
learn about, so they could fall in love with a book. And so knowing and seeing my students struggle through that, that really got me interested in literacy. And so it was then I decided to go back to graduate school,
Okay.
and I specifically studied reading instruction. And so took courses on, reading assessment and reading disabilities, reading intervention, and all of that stuff. And so then I ultimately became a reading specialist.
Okay.
So I've been in that role for about, I guess this is my 4th year, actually.
Awesome. Now, your road to structured literacy, it wasn't a straight path. In fact, you have an interesting story about reading courses as an undergrad. Do you mind sharing those experiences from the beginning years that sort of shaped your mission as an educator today?
Absolutely, yes. So during my undergraduate education, I vividly remember I had one course in writing and one course in reading.
One.
And um, yeah, yeah. And I was expected to teach children how to read and write. And so in my reading course, I remember learning a lot about read alouds and a lot of comprehension strategies and that type of thing. And recently, I actually went back. I still have my binders from undergrad and grad school. I went back and I actually looked through my papers to see, did we talk about the foundations of literacy? Did we, did I miss it? Was I just not paying attention? And I found one paper. We had one class, just one
Yeah.
night class devoted to foundations of literacy, including phonics. We did not even talk about phonemic awareness. We didn't talk about, syntax, nothing like that. It was devoted to phonics. And then I was expected to go out and teach students how to
Yeah.
read. Um, so that happened in undergrad. And then I went back to grad school. For a specific focus in reading instruction. And like I said, I had courses in reading disabilities, reading intervention, assessment, reading assessments, the whole gamut, right?
Hmm.
And it was only after I had graduated with my master's degree. And I got hired as a literacy specialist
Right.
and at a middle school. And I was working with these middle school students. And I was like, I actually really still don't know what to do. I have, these leveled readers, but they're not really working out and they still
Sure.
can't read those. And I was confused and I was frustrated, and I'm always wanting to learn more. And so that's kind of where I was. And it wasn't until I actually talked to our speech language pathologist who really opened up the door of how we actually learn to read and how best to teach reading.
Okay. Now, when we talk about literacy instruction, we know there are many different ways to proceed. We have balanced literacy, we have guided reading, we have structured literacy, and that probably only just names a few. Now, you've had the opportunity to practice in each of these 3 areas, but ultimately you're a supporter of structured literacy. So, can you talk a little bit more why you believe structured literacy is so important?
For sure. So, like you said, I've had experience in all of those. I've balanced literacy. That was actually, I did a paper on that in grad school, all about balanced literacy. I've done the guided reading assessments, the running records,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. And that didn't quite give my students the support that they needed, both those in reading intervention and those just general education students as well. And so, structured literacy, what I have found is a very explicit, systematic, and sequential way to teach literacy,
Okay.
both foundational reading skills and then also those higher level reading skills as well. And so, with structured literacy, from the get go, students are reading or are receiving that explicit instruction. So, regardless if they need it or not, all students are going to receive it. And that's going to benefit every single student, whether it's with foundational reading skills or, again, those higher level literacy skills as well. And so, making sure that I service all of my students. And, we talk about differentiation all of the time.
Oh,
And
sure.
so, this is, yeah, yeah. And so, this is just a really easy way to make sure from the get go that all of my students are receiving what they need through that explicit instruction. And then the really cool thing that I love about structured literacy is that there's no room for guessing.
Okay.
Students are explicitly taught what we are expecting them to know and to do. And so let's say that I'm teaching about consonant vowel consonant words. And I'm not going to give them a book that has, R controlled vowels or higher level phonics skills, right?
Right.
In that book, whenever I'm teaching those foundational literacy skills, it's going to have CVC words. It's not going to be anything higher, and it's going to help support them. So kind of like training wheels, right, on a bike. And so
Sure.
students get that support that they need. And so number one, that empowers the student to feel successful, that they're not just beaten down by really tough things that they can't access, but they're like, oh, wow, yes, I am a reader. I can do this. And so I really, really love that for the students and just making sure that, again, all students get the instruction that they need. And again, of course, you will differentiate if you have higher level students or, what have you. But from the get go, everyone gets what they need. And it just makes sense because it builds on each other and it's not spotty in instruction.
Absolutely. Now, so would you say you've been doing structured literacy in the 4 years since you've become a literacy specialist, or were you doing it before then?
Yes, no, so only after I became a reading specialist
Okay.
that, and, to be honest, that first year I was a reading specialist, that was like my learning year. And that was actually, coincidentally the year that, the world got shut down by COVID. So I had a lot of time to learn, and so I was learning that year. And then immediately, as soon as I learned and my world was open to, oh my goodness, this is how students learn to read. These are best practices. That's whenever I began to implement it.
Okay. And now,
So
what tier is the instruction that we're talking about?
sure. So currently I service tier two and tier three students, but these students can be gen ed, so students without IEPs.
Okay.
And then I can service some students with IEPs as well. For the most part, though, I service just gen ed students, so students that have just not received that explicit instruction. And honestly, with a lot of the students that I service, once they receive that explicit instruction, they're off. They know
Sure.
how to read. And so it's really eye-opening because it's like, man, what would you be like right now? How successful would you be right now if you received that from the get-go
Yeah.
in your foundational, elementary years? So very rarely, to be honest with you, do I have a student who, say, might have dyslexia. Some of them, are maybe on the higher end of the spectrum, but for the most part, it's literally just gen ed students who never received that explicit instruction.
Okay. Now, is structured literacy something that we could find as a tier one practice?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I really hope that happens, especially in the elementary years, because it would be a dream for me if I had students specifically with reading disabilities, right?
Sure.
I would love to have all of my gen ed students just back, not having to receive intervention. And so, what I have seen or what I've heard from different districts and just different teachers is that whenever they implement it in their, tier one gen ed classroom, from the get go, they have fewer groups of students that actually have to go out and receive intervention
Oh,
from a
okay.
reading interventionist or specialist. Yep.
Oh, so there's a little bit of data to back this up that it's maybe a good tier one practice.
Absolutely. Yes.
All right. So, in a conversation that I've had with you previously, you mentioned the science behind learning to read and the brain. And you pointed out that, and it took me by surprise here, but that the brain, the way the brain learns, reading is not something that comes naturally. So, how does this support your practice of structured literacy?
For sure. So, believe it or not, once I graduated grad school, I still thought that learning to read, everybody knew how to do it. It was a natural thing, right? So once I found out that, hey, learning to read is not natural. Yeah.
Yeah.
Marion Wolf once said that it is actually the world's greatest invention and relatively new as well. I want to
Okay.
say, don't quote me if I'm wrong. I want to say 6,000 years, I
Okay.
think. And so the way in which we learn to read. So language is natural, right? So we can speak.
Right.
But reading is a completely different thing. So we have to take that text and turn it into speech, right?
Uh-huh.
And so literally we have to create these new neural connections in our brain in order to just read one word, which is wild. I
It
mean, and
really is.
yeah, and this is something that I tell my students, my middle school students all the time because often they come to me and they're beat down, they've experienced years of academic failure, and we explicitly talk and I show them a picture of the brain and I say, "Hey, this is what goes on in your brain. And in this classroom right now, we are going to be working extra hard to try to rewire your brain so that you can become a fluent reader. So the work that we do in this class is going to be super, super important and help you set up for success in your other classes as well." And I always say, people will say reading is either easy or boring or something like that. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, if you can see your brain whenever you read one word, you
Yeah,
would be like, oh my goodness.
it lights
Yeah.
up.
Yes. Yes.
That's fun. Now,
Yeah.
when we talk about the foundational skills of reading, we typically see this emphasized the most in our primary years. In fact, many curricula that are available to districts in their phonics instruction at second grade. Now, I believe we're beginning to see how we need explicit practice in these foundational skills beyond second grade. So let's talk for a moment on the right and wrong times to have foundational skill instruction.
Sure. So, to begin, so the right time for foundational skill instruction. Again, and we've heard this. Many people believe this. Many companies that develop curriculum believe this. That once you hit that third grade mark, you quit learning to read and you
Right?
read to learn. Right? Yes. And so
Yeah.
that's like a common thing, right? However, I would say that you need to have that good universal screener or benchmark in place at the beginning of the year to let you know, okay, if I have students who are performing below the 20th percentile or 10th percentile or whatever it may be, that's going to be a red flag for me. Then, as a teacher, what I would do is I would go in and I would do some diagnostic assessments, whether that's letter naming or letter sounds,
Okay.
maybe some encoding, so some writing. Can they write, basic words type of thing? Because that's going to inform my instruction and what I need to do and how I can support my students in my class.
Uh-huh.
So if I see that there's a class-wide need in, let's say, basic phonics in third grade, then absolutely you need to incorporate that into your instruction. Otherwise, your students are not going to be able to access your content.
Ah.
Um, yeah, and I would also argue and say that in third grade, you still need to be teaching those advanced phonics concepts as
Yeah,
well.
give us an example of advanced phonics because you gave this whenever we talked, but give a quick example.
Sure. So, for example, you could say how the diphthong OW, not only does it say ow, but it also says O. So knowing when to use which sound. You could talk about consonant LE syllables. You could also, and I would encourage this third, fourth, fifth, I would even encourage this up to middle school to explicitly teach morphology. So a
Okay.
morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language. And so not only if you are teaching, let's say, suffix LESS, if you're teaching the meaning and also teaching how to spell it, the sound of it, words that are associated with it, not only are you supporting that word recognition, so how to read those words, but you're also supporting their vocabulary development. And just with those common suffixes or prefixes or roots, you're not only going to support their word recognition, but then you're going to open up so many words in regard to learning their meanings as well.
Okay. So when you talk about that morphology and going up, I think you said even into middle school and junior high. I mean, we're still talking morphology is still part of foundational skills, right? So, are you seeing that some districts? I'm just trying to connect this in here. Some districts are saying we're done with the foundational skills at second grade, but when you just gave a wide range of examples. We can't possibly teach all of that to our kindergarten through second grade students and expect them to retain it, right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And so that's why teachers, they need this training in structured literacy to know what to teach, but then also to implement it. And even middle school, like I said, middle school reading teachers, and I want to say sixth grade has a reading standard that specifically deals with Greek and Latin affixes or something along those lines. And
Sure.
so I remember myself as an eighth grade reading teacher seeing standards that talked about morphology, and I was like, yeah, whatever. Like that's boring. I'm not gonna do that, even though it was a standard. I mean, so
Yeah.
I completely just disregarded it. But that's because of my lack of knowledge. But little did I know how imperative and how just life-changing teaching that to students would be. And the really cool thing is I'm getting to see that, with my own eyes, with my students, my students again who are reading three to four grade levels below what they're supposed to be, but talking about how the suffix s changes plural present tense, and them
Yeah.
noticing that in their reading and making those connections, it's truly amazing.
Well, it really is. And at the end of this episode, I'll have your Twitter handle out because I want all my listeners to follow you. But when they do, they'll notice that, I mean, you celebrate quite a bit of your students' success. And so, I mean, you're seeing this in the classroom day in, day out.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And even, I mean, people and districts always talk about data, and truly the data also shows that, whenever I progress monitor them and we celebrate together, and I'm like, look, like you are improving. Like what we are doing in here, you're putting in the serious work and you are improving your reading skills. And this is amazing because this is, super hard. You're changing your brain structure, especially for those older kiddos.
Yeah, that's exciting. Now, speaking of exciting, it's a great segue. Before we go, you are coming off an exciting summer in which you co founded and co coordinated Camp Monarch, Evolving with Dyslexia, which was a summer camp to help students gain confidence in reading, math, and writing using multisensory Orton Gillingham based teaching methods. You also had which that's a mouthful in itself. We'll get back to that. But you also had some exciting partners in this adventure. I believe that listeners would like to find out a little bit more on how this came to be and what the future goals for Camp Monarch are.
For sure. Yeah. So Camp Monarch kind of evolved from a group of parents and educators. And it's actually really funny. I met this group of parents because once I discussed with our speech language pathologist the science behind learning how to read and talking about dyslexia. And I was like, oh, I'm a reading specialist. I should probably know about this. I did a little research on my own and I found this wonderful group of parents specifically devoted to dyslexia. And they taught me more than my graduate degree, to be honest with you. They
Wow.
gave me resources and, all of that. But anyway, so it was with this group of parents and then educators, and we saw a need in our community. Our students with dyslexia were not being served by our school districts.
Okay.
There are no dyslexia therapists or dyslexia interventions in place. A lot of school districts don't even say the word dyslexia. And so it's a
Oh.
really, really big problem. And so we kind of put our heads together and we were like, what can we do to help these students? We can't sit around for other people to do this. We
Mm-hmm.
we want to take action and do it ourselves. And so we were like, okay, ultimately we would maybe like to start a school or something big like that, but we had a small scale and thought about a summer camp. And so we actually worked with Parkland Community College
Okay.
in kind of developing this summer camp because they do a college for kids. And so their community ed coordinator at the time was fabulous to work with, worked with her. But then we were like, okay, so we have a spot, we have this idea for a camp. Now we need teachers, but we need trained teachers and trained teachers in or in Gillingham or any type of methodology that helps support students with dyslexia is really honestly far and few in between right now
Sure.
in Central Illinois anyway. And so I remember we looked into a lot of different OG based curriculum such as Barton, Wilson, all of that stuff, but everything is so super expensive. And so we actually found through another colleague in the state in Northern Illinois, there is something called SLANT, structured literacy. And so we reached out to them,
Yeah.
and they can be, they're a program, an Orton Gillingham based program that is amazing. So they were able to train all of our teachers. So we had 9 total teachers. They were able to train all of our
Wow.
teachers. Yeah, in these structured literacy methodology. And so now we have 9 teachers, not only that are supporting our students at Camp Monarch, but are going back into
Oh,
our
sure.
school districts. Yeah, to support those students. And so that was kind of our hope with that as well, as not only supporting the students at the camp, but being able to reach, broader and our public education students as well. So we partnered with them, and they are amazing. So they're actually out of Downers Grove, Illinois.
Okay.
They trained our teachers. They actually came down to Champaign and did a coaching session with each of our teachers, which was phenomenal. It was amazing. So we partnered with them, but then we also partnered with Stand for Children. So it's actually a national organization, but we partnered with the Illinois sector of it.
Okay.
And one of their big advocacy pieces right now is early literacy. And so we partnered with them, and we're able to do some fellowship opportunities and some advocacy in that way. And they were able to come down to Camp Monarch actually as well, visit it, talk to the teachers, get to know the teachers, hear from teachers and their experiences with structured literacy versus what they've experienced before. So it was a really, really, truly amazing experience. And so we had camp for 4 weeks. It's funny, I was actually looking at the data the other day, and the growth in just 4 weeks was amazing.
Really?
And it's crazy because that's a really short amount of time, right?
Yeah.
And so it got me thinking, and I was like, whoa, if these students had this all year long, like, it would be amazing. It would be awesome. And so it was truly an amazing experience. And it was really cool because our students got to experience or meet new kids that experience the same difficulties as them. Another really, really cool thing that we did is we built in a social emotional piece.
Oh,
So we had a specific social emotional time of each day. And we actually collaborated with Dr. Jennifer Huffman from the Able Center in
okay.
Champaign. And she's a neuropsychologist. And so she helped us develop this curriculum to teach students how their brains learn, their strengths, and how they can advocate for themselves at school with their teachers and utilize their strengths as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was truly an amazing experience. We are definitely planning on doing it next year. We really hope to expand, and we hope to provide more professional development opportunities for teachers, but then also a space for students and families to receive support, resources, and just a place to collaborate as well.
Awesome. That is a lot packed into 4 weeks.
Yes.
I can only imagine how this is going to grow and take off. I know on the link to today's episode on my website, I'm going to put information on there for SLANT and Stand for Children. Correct?
Yes.
Stand for
Yep.
Children. So we're
Yep.
going to get that on there. And so one last thing before we finish today, I just got to know, at the beginning of this episode, you talked about you shied away from statistics. And I don't know if my listeners have picked up on this, but you've been talking about percentiles, you've been talking about data. So where do you stand on the statistics right now?
Yeah, well, that's so it's so funny because I've come full circle, right? So yeah, I growing up, I had a lot of math anxiety. I still have a lot of math anxiety. And so I saw that and was like, absolutely not. I love statistics now. I love data. And I know a lot of teachers roll their eyes whenever they hear the word data, but I love data, and I love looking at statistics in regard to reading, writing, anything literacy related. So,
Yeah. Well, and
yeah.
I know that data has often become kind of a dirty word that, like you said, you see the eye rolls and all the murmurs and everything. But when utilized properly, data is amazing, and
Yeah.
it can tell an incredible picture that can really inform not only where we've been, where we are, but also where we're going.
Absolutely. Yes.
All right, Kellyn, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Thank you for having me.
Like I said, you need to go follow Kellyn on Twitter. You can find her at KSIRACH. And don't forget to head over to escottengland.com and click on the Read More link to read more about Kellyn. You can also find those links to those organizations that we talked about. And don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Now, I told you in the beginning that she was passionate about reading. I have followed Kellyn for quite some time on Twitter, and I can tell you she has not wavered in her commitment to students. Her and I had the opportunity to talk a couple of weeks before we recorded this podcast. I commented to her that in her time as an educator, she is instructed in a variety of ways that both align with structured literacy and in ways that are completely different. I asked her what she thought about the great debate in the reading instruction. She had a very sensible answer in that sometimes as teachers, we have to use what the district has in place for us. Other times we may not know of a better way to lead instruction. Admittedly, she did say there is a great debate out there in which some are firmly rooted in their position. I asked Kellyn if it would be okay to invite educators who believe in a different approach to reading to join this podcast. She wholeheartedly agreed it would be a great idea. So I guess this is an invite to anyone who is on the other side of the reading fence to join me for a conversation on Anchored in Education. This is truly the best practice of getting information out there. We all like to be presented with multiple viewpoints and then given the freedom to decide on our own. I was an elementary teacher of first and third graders for 5 years. I practiced the structured literacy approach. But Kellyn and I agree that as long as you are doing what you feel is best for kids, then we will support you. Because the kids is what this is all about. If they learn, we all win. And remember, at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.